Hello again, Tara here with chapter 14 of The Bridge to Belle Island. We keep finding out little pieces at a time with each character. Everybody's just hiding a little bit of something, and Benjamin Booker just keeps chipping away at it. It'll eventually all come tumbling out, I think. Alright, chapter 14. On his way back to the house, Benjamin saw young Joe playing on the lawn with Miss Wilder's puppy. It must be the weaver's mealtime. Benjamin asked him, "What, no book today?" "I finished it." "And not yet started another?" "I've read them all." "Oh? And where did you find such a treasure trove of books?" "Miss Wilder, sir. They were her brother's. She let me borrow them, but I've read them all now, sad to say." "That was good of her." The youth shrugged. "Yes, she is good and kind." The lad looked at him closely. Too closely. "You don't believe me, do you?" "I don't know her very well." "Well, I have known her all my life, and I like her and trust her." "I'm glad to hear you say so. But you see, I liked and trusted a woman once, and it turned out badly for me." "That's not Miss Wilder's fault." Ben looked at the youth, impressed. "You're right. It's not." He changed the subject. "So, how did the book end? Did the highwayman go free?" Joe shook his head. "No, he got justice in the end." The boy sat cross-legged on the grass, and the puppy climbed onto his lap to be petted. "In the last chapter he holds up the same gentleman's carriage a second time. He disarms the guard and takes the lady's jewels while the dandy sits there, helpless once more, or so you believe. But that dandy has learnt his lesson. He had hidden a gun and shoots the highwayman straight through the heart. It was justice, I know, though still a sad ending." Joe sighed. "Never cared much for the dandy." Benjamin thought, then asked, "Have you read Gulliver's Travels?" "No, sir." "I have a copy with me. I will loan it to you if you promise to take good care of it." "I will, sir, I promise." Benjamin ruffled the boy's hair and continued toward the house. As he entered, he heard voices coming from the drawing-room. He paused at the threshold and looked inside, his head rearing back in surprise. Robert Hardy sat on a chair near Miss Wilder, the two talking and laughing like old friends. She glanced up and noticed him. "Oh, there you are, Mr. Booker. Mr. Hardy was just sharing a few memories of my father. I did not realize they were acquainted, though perhaps I should have." Hardy nodded, eyes warm with nostalgia. "Oh, yes. Jonathan Wilder would drop by our offices when he was in London. He came to see Percy, of course, but he and I became acquainted during those visits as well. He once brought me a box of the best cigars I ever had. From India, I believe he said." Miss Wilder nodded. "Yes, my father was partial to those. My mother less so." She smiled and gestured Benjamin closer. "Join us." Benjamin sat, feeling oddly disoriented to see two previously separate parts of his world collide. Mr. Hardy leaned forward, eyes alight. "One evening, Percy was keen to play cards, but your father was not a gambling man. We needed a fourth, so he begrudgingly consented to play, but only on the condition that all the winnings be donated to Coram's Foundling Hospital." Isabel chuckled. "Sounds like father." Hardy nodded. "Percy, Hunt, and I moaned and groaned, but eventually agreed. And at the end of the evening, your father might have had cause to repent that decision. He'd won £400. That's a lot of money." True to his word, he donated every farthing. The governors were very grateful. With a closed-lipped smile and tears in her eyes, Miss Wilder's face shone with poignant pleasure. After a moment of respectful silence passed, Benjamin spoke up. "I am happy to see you here, sir, though also surprised." "Are you?" but you wrote and asked about the terms of the Wilder Trust. I thought it best to bring you the documents myself. Some things one does not trust to the post. Very true. Thank you, sir. His mentor gestured to Isabel. Miss Wilder has been graciousness itself and invited me to stay for a few days while you and I work through the details. I'm afraid Hunt Sr. composed the original documents, and as he was known for verbosity and painstaking thoroughness, it may take some untangling. He smiled at her. But if anyone can make sense of it, Mr. Booker can. Never knew a young man with a keener mind. Miss Wilder sent Benjamin an appraising look at that, then rose. Well, I shall leave you to it. Oh, sorry. Miss Wilder sent Benjamin an appraising look at that, then rose. Well, I shall leave you to it. Mr. Booker can show you the way to the study. Anything you gentlemen need, just let me know. I will ask Jacob to build up the fire. Benjamin and Mr. Hardy rose as well. Very kind, madam, very thoughtful. The older man said warmly, You remind me of my own dear daughter. She turned back, her countenance alight with interest. Have you a daughter? How lovely. What is her name, if I may ask? Indeed you may. It is a proud father's pleasure to describe his children, after all. My Cordelia is a fine, accomplished young lady. She married Mr. Ralph Farnsworth some 18 months ago, and I'm delighted to say the happy couple have just given me my first grandchild. How wonderful! Isabel enthused. And mother and babe are well? Indeed, perfectly well. What a blessing! I am so happy for you. Benjamin cleared a sudden lump in his throat. And I, sir. Congratulations. Mr. Hardy clapped his shoulder and holding his gaze in a long, understanding look. I had hoped for a different son-in-law, but in the end I must be grateful. Yes, of course you must, Benjamin said with more conviction than he felt. He became aware of Miss Wilder's sympathetic gaze, and his ears heated in embarrassment. Now she will know Miss Hardy chose another man over me, and is no doubt not surprised. When Miss Wilder left them, Benjamin led Mr. Hardy to the study. There he faced his mentor, feeling ill at ease, wondering if the man was displeased with him, despite his praise to their hostess. I know I have been away longer than anticipated, but... Never mind that. Mr. Hardy waved away his excuses. I've come with news. He shut the door securely and took a seat, directing Benjamin to sit as well. There's been a development. I've thought of writing to you, but felt you should know directly. What is it? There has been another death. Mary Williams, the maid employed in Percival's household. The Wilders' household, I believe you mean. Another dismissive wave. He lived there too. This is no time for splitting hairs. Sorry. How did she die? Poisoned. She was found in a lodging house, in a room rented by a young carter named Lester Crabb. Her beau, apparently. He reported the death himself. He'd left her sleeping, or so he thought, and went off to make an out-of-town delivery. He was shocked to return 2 days later to a dead woman in his bed, as you can imagine, and her only 20. A bottle was found on the side table bearing a Belle Island label. Benjamin took the news like a punch to his gut. A second poisoning. He drew a shaky breath and tried to keep his expression and tone even. How is it the young man was spared? Never cared for wine, apparently, and didn't take any. Wise choice in this case. Is he a suspect in her death? Ordinarily he would be, but a man would be a fool to poison a victim in his own room and then alert the constable himself. He made no effort to remove the bottle or any evidence of their previous activities. And considering the extenuating circumstances, the fact that this is the second suspected poisoning by Wilder wine, I don't think he'll be charged. Benjamin's mind whirled. Why would anyone want to harm the maid? Do you think she might have seen something that night? Knew more than she let on about Mr. Norris's death? Perhaps she got greedy and tried to extort money from someone. Mr. Hardy stared, taking it all in. Goodness, how your mind works. Have you another theory? Hardy rubbed his jaw. Actually, you may be right. Do you recall when the maid told the officer she'd heard Percival arguing with some fellow before she left the house? When the officer asked who it was, she hesitated before saying she'd never heard him mention a name. Benjamin nodded. I do recall that, though we both know it's hardly solid evidence. True. Benjamin's mind continued to spin with possibilities. He said, perhaps there is a far simpler explanation. Perhaps both bottles were poisoned to assure whichever Percival drank would be his last. And if Miss Williams helped herself to the second bottle, not realizing the risk, her death was accidental, or at least not planned by the poisoner. Mr. Hardy slowly nodded. I agree, that sounds more likely. Benjamin shook his head, guilt pinching him. We ought to have considered that, warned the staff, and searched for additional bottles. Mr. Hardy laid a hand on his arm. The coroner should have done so. He is the one responsible for preventing further harm. Or perhaps the Bow Street officer, but not you. This is not your fault, Benjamin. Your brother dismissed your poisoning theory initially, remember? And assuming the maid stole the bottle, she is not a completely innocent party. I hardly think the fatal punishment fits the rather minor crime. No, Hardy sighed deeply. It is an unfortunate business. I agree. The question remaining is, who poisoned the wine and where? Is not the most likely scenario that the wine was poisoned here by Miss Wilder, especially for Percy? I don't know, sir. I don't think Miss Wilder would have done so, but... Worry lined his mentor's face. Careful, Ben. Remember what happened the last time you trusted a pretty woman. You needn't remind me. I am hourly aware. But any of the servants, or Miss Lawrence, or even Mr. Adair might have tampered with it in London. Good point. Mr. Hardy nodded, then added, Before I left town, I asked their housekeeper to make sure no other bottles were in the house. She reported finding none. Have you inspected the wine cellar here? Benjamin swallowed another guilty lump. No. I judged it unlikely she would poison bottles made for her own use. Besides, I would not know what to look for. I am not an apothecary. But your father is, as was mine. Like yours, my father wanted me to follow him into physic, but I chose a different career, as you have. Yes, Benjamin murmured. He had never told Mr. Hardy the real reason he had shunned the medical profession, his inability to measure up to his naturally gifted brother or their father's expectations. Thinking of the congenial scene he'd interrupted between Mr. Hardy and Miss Wilder, he quickly changed the subject. Why did you say nothing of the maid's death to Miss Wilder? Because I wanted to speak to you privately first. I didn't want to warn her, give her a cause to scurry about getting rid of evidence before we have a chance to search for it. I see. Benjamin hesitated. He hated the thought of sneaking around another person's house, especially hers. Mr. Hardy said kindly, I understand your reticence, but we are justified. Our goal is to protect anyone else from poisoning, accidental or otherwise. Very well. I found an architect's plan for the house when going through the papers in the study. I think I could find the door, or we could simply ask her, you know. She would not prevent us from going down there. After she has removed all traces of poison, perhaps. Then should we go down there now? Hardy thought, not yet. I've just arrived and she may be watching. I'll take a look at that plan, but let's get you started on the trust first. So if she asks, you can report on our progress. We don't want to raise suspicion unnecessarily. Ben agreed, relieved to put off the prying task for as long as possible. Hardy pulled a folder from his brief bag and laid it on the desk. Then he looked at Ben with sympathy. I know it seems intrusive, but don't feel guilty. It's only a matter of time until someone searches the place. With Mary Williams dead, I imagine Officer Riley will be coming here any day. His mentor had intended to comfort him, Benjamin knew, but his words had the opposite effect. Mr. Hardy sat on the velvet sofa near the window. Benjamin handed him the rolled plan, then returned to the desk and centered the leather folder before him. The folder was an inch thick, so Benjamin put on his spectacles in readiness for a lot of tedious reading. Have you already gone through this? Hardy waved his hand. Skimmed only enough to confirm my memory. I vaguely recall Mr. Wilder asking if he could list my name as a possible successor in the event Percival was unable or unwilling to serve. Apparently I agreed without giving it another thought. I knew Percy was willing, so I never imagined this day would come. No, of course not, Ben murmured, absorbing the news. Mr. Hardy was the successor. Ben understood why the man's memory might be foggy. The senior partner had probably composed and reviewed 1,000 legal documents in the years since. Mr. Hardy sighed, looking tired. In all honesty, I wish I had not agreed. I have my hands full with the firm and looked forward to spending all my leisure hours spoiling my new grandson. I won't be able to devote nearly as much time to the Wilder estate as Percy did. Ben knew Miss Wilder, Miss Lawrence, and even the London servants disapproved of how Mr. Norris had carried out his duties, but did not say so to his old friend. Hardy added, In your letter you mentioned Miss Wilder hopes to go on without a successor. I don't know if the trust includes contingencies for bringing that about. I plan to study the details on the journey here, but reading while in motion makes me ill. All right if I leave it to you? Yes, of course. Mr. Hardy glanced at the house plan, then set it aside. Will you think me terribly doddering if I close my eyes for a few minutes? I didn't sleep well last night and shared a coach with 2 screaming toddlers. Not at all. I know how tiring travel can be. Ben licked dry lips, then added, Though I suppose you shall have to grow accustomed to such sounds in the near future. Robert Hardy stretched out on the sofa, keeping his shoes considerately clear of the upholstery. Very true, though somehow I think it will be more endearing from one's own grandchild. He grinned at the thought, laid his head on the plush arm of the sofa, and closed his eyes. Banishing the image of Cordelia's face from his mind, Benjamin opened the folder and began sorting through the documents within. The folder included a copy of Mrs. Wilder's simple last will and testament, bequeathing her personal possessions to her daughters, followed by Mr. Wilder's longer will, which directed that his estate, assets, real and personal property be disposed of as directed by the established trust. Benjamin turned to it next. He first skimmed through the articles describing the establishment of the trust, grantor Jonathan Wilder, trustee Percival Norris, then flipped past the articles about the rights and methods to amend, revoke, or terminate the trust agreement. It took some time as the language was complicated and the organization convoluted, as Mr. Hardy had predicted, but eventually he came to what he was looking for. Successor trustee. He ran his finger along the text and read quietly to himself. In the event Percival Norris is deceased, unwilling, or unable to serve, etc., etc., then Robert Hardy shall serve as successor trustee. Just as Mr. Hardy had said. He read a bit further. In the event Robert Hardy is unable or unwilling to serve, etc., etc., then I authorize the firm of Norris, Hardy, and Hunt to appoint a qualified successor trustee. Benjamin sat back. He removed his spectacles and considered the situation. His initial reaction of surprise was followed by relief. They were not dealing with some stranger or impersonal bank or corporation. Rose's fear that the successor trustee would be more controlling and miserly than Mr. Norris was unfounded. Robert Hardy was firm yet fair, even generous. Miss Wilder's hopes that there would be no successor at all were not realized. but her concerns should be at least partially alleviated by learning Robert Hardy was the successor. She seemed to like him already. Whether she had grounds to refuse a new trustee was more complicated. He would have to review the lengthy articles that prescribed the rights and methods to amend, revoke, or terminate the trust agreement. Mr. Wilder, as grantor, could have done so at any time were he alive, but it would be much more difficult to do now that he was gone. A growl of his stomach alerted Ben to his mounting hunger. He glanced up at the clock. The family would soon be dressing for dinner. He would try to catch Miss Wilder alone and give her the news in person. Even though Mr. Hardy was not eager for the role, Ben knew his mentor well enough to know he was not one to shirk his responsibilities. He glanced across the room again, tempted to confirm his willingness. But Mr. Hardy's mouth had fallen slack, and a soft snore rumbled from his throat. Oh, let him sleep, he told himself. There would be time enough for legalities later. Looking fondly at the man, Ben thought of a long-ago memory, of Mr. Hardy asking him, perhaps a year after he'd started at the firm, why he had chosen law over medicine. Ben had replied, "I never cared for any of it, not the work itself, nor the accompanying smells and sights. I swept and dusted and completed tasks in the physic garden when required, but could not wait to leave it all behind me. And all I wanted to do was read and study the law." Hardy had nodded approvingly. "Just as I did at that age. We are men more at home with legal language, leather volumes, and lengthy rhetoric. I applaud you for charting your own course in life." He'd squeezed Benjamin's shoulder with affection. "Like the son I wished I had." Benjamin's chest had expanded with pleasure and pride at the words. He had long seen himself as the second best son, the son who would always be a disappointment. It felt good to be the wished-for son in his respected mentor's eyes. He'd walked with his head held higher for days afterward. Even now, Ben was proud to have earned Mr. Hardy's trust and esteem. He hoped he had not jeopardized both by his recent failure. With renewed determination, Benjamin resolved not to let his attraction to Miss Wilder impede his search for the truth. See you soon.